Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Brightest webinar powered by Brightest. So today we will receive Luigi Buglione, who is a measurement and process improvement specialist at Ingegneria Informatica. I hope I said that okay, Luigi. But you will continue to present yourself much better than what I am doing now. Today, so we're going to speak about measurement, we're going to speak about ITIL, and we will be able to discuss all the comments and questions you may have about this presentation at the end of it. So what I will offer to you to do today is please keep your microphones and cameras off for now, but please feel free to let your comments in the chat option that you have at the bottom of the screen. I will be looking at everything and following up so we can make all your questions to Luigi at the end. So Luigi, how are you? How is everything?
Thank you. Good morning to everyone. Hope you are fine and in a very good state, and thank you for joining this next Brightest webinar. As all the other webinars, the past and the new ones, please remember this web address also for looking any other next webinar you could join and book yet today for the next month. Today we are going to speak about a good marriage that is between one of the most used, if not the most used, framework for service management and measurement, not necessarily one specific techniques that could be function points or measurement about lines of code or something like that. We are speaking about services, and the goals for this presentation are, first of all, to show the new ITIL IT Service Management Framework, the version 4 born in the end of February 2019, and it introduces several new stuffs, very useful. Goal number 2 will be to understand one part of the model that is very, very useful, the so-called guiding principles. And I'm going to introduce you in which are these guiding principles, and of course, in which way measurement can be a good friend about this guiding principle and a good service management performance for your project, whatever the kind of application domain that can be in IT, outside of IT, or your business is supported by IT in general, and show also some examples, some tips, better, for each one of the guiding principles where measurement can be a good friend for a good service performance. Of course, many of us, I recognize your name, are measurement people, certified or not, but fascinated by measurement and what measurement can do for taking best decision in a project. Just to introduce myself, I don't know if you can see also my face by screen, but anyway, I'm one people working in measurement and process improvement for more than 30 years. I started with economics and accountability, but always looking the computer science as a background for the economic part of my studies. And currently I'm the president for the Italian Function Point User Group. In Italy, the International Function Point User Group, I'm currently the director for sizing standards, but I'm also looking in ISBSG what can be and what can mean to have benchmarks with this software metrics. In the latest 15 years, I'm more and more involved also in the service and governance field, and I'm training daily people also in ITIL, DevOps, and other methodologies. And so that's why we start this presentation yet moving from the beginning, because many of us are working, speaking about software, and many organizations, also my organization, engineering, that is the name of the Italian company I'm working for many years, develop software, and many models and many assessments are only about development, not only about the operation side of the development. And so one problem could be often to understand, since my first job is to measure, to size function points, whatever kind of, if cosmic, Garner, any kind of metric, is to develop a software, but a function point, for instance, does not have any relation, direct relation, in terms of the effort performed in the operation side, because it's another kind of project and another WBS and Gantt chart you have to you have to create for being interacting with the dev side. And then, of course, there is this kind of situation. You create a software, this software becomes the basis for a service, and you run the operation side of your project. There could be change request due to incident, to service request at all. That can mean, in general, to have maintenance activities. There is another chunk in the 1, 2, 3 schema, because your service is the summation for the three parts. And when many of us speaks typically about a DevOps approach, it does mean exactly to link the dev part with the ops part of an organization, and then to consider not only a generic maintenance activities, but as in this standard, there is the ISO 14764, as cited not only from the IFPAC function point counting practice manual, but also from many other ISO standards and practices, we can have different kind of maintenance. And if we are going to look these three chunks of activities against the PMBOK definition that a project should be only this temporary endeavor, while there are not one, but three different projects into a wider scope, is possible if we merge the project management approach with a service management approach as described by ITIL, the IT Information Library, that born at the end of the 80s for assessing and improving the service management side for an organization, whatever kind of organization, can be rephrased using the version 3 labeling into activities that are referred to the development, typically to the design and the realization, the construction of a software project, the operation with the operational side. The maintenance is in the middle way between these two temporary time lapse. And this is why we speak also in GUFPISM, the Italian Association for Metrics and not only for function points, that should be better for a better management of your activities to split your service scope at least into three coordinated but independent and separated project in order to keep the best from each part and then to link all the parts together. ITIL is not the only IT service methodology, because you can use eventually Microsoft MOF, that is the Microsoft Operation Framework. You can use and eventually browse, because here under the pictures I've inserted, if you want to download the PDF version for these slides, also some hyperlinks for your readings. And IT4IT FITSM, for instance, is another light version for ITIL used in several UE community projects, and the CMMI for services is a rephrasing of ITIL, but using the CMMI for development language. There is one very known maturity and capability model. But ITIL is the first and the more important method in IT service management. It comes from the English government from the beginning. That does mean that it was not a provider or a consultant, the people providing the suggestion we are going to discuss. So it's more relevant for a provider for that reason, because it's a sort of guideline for getting you more and more from the customer's viewpoint and eyes. From the version 2, 2005, it moved to a process view, exactly according to what ISO standard, for instance, the so-called ISO 2000, Vision 2000, the 2000 version for ISO 9001 standard moved, as well as the other standards from that period, as well as also the family of standards for service management are doing from that period. It represents the largest base of people certified, individually certified with ITIL before version 3, and now from a couple of years also with version 4. And it's one, if not the solely model, against also these possible competitors for ITIL, dealing with economics and financials that are concretely part for the work of anybody of us looking to your organizations for concretely doing some correct and proper estimates in terms of effort before, but also about economics. And the other very good point is that ITIL is merged intrinsically with lean and agile practice, and it concurs actively also to what many people call the DevOps approach. And another very good point, reintroducing ITIL4 are, for instance, this process about measurement and reporting that was that became a technique in ITIL3, and the service level management practice that is, of course, moreover, the solely production of a software product, another very fundamental process and practice in all our activities. No matter if you are a provider, a customer, consultant for a third part, because you need to measure. But anyway, just because I don't know if anybody of you is aware about the basics for ITIL4, ITIL4 now had at least three main concepts. The so-called 4 dimension that represents 4 pillars for building your building, in terms of the 4 pillars about organization and people, data, information and technology, partners and third party and suppliers to be eventually involved in your business, and processes also to be rephrased on a periodical basis in terms of value streams. The final goal, not only for services, but also for products, that can be a software to be used. And when a software is used, it becomes a service or part of a service. The final goal is to achieve value. Value does mean the benefit perceived by users of a service. And from the beginning, ITIL4 suggests, for instance, to consider these 6 external factors. And the acronym composing the 6 letters is PESTLE or PESTLE, because it does mean that you have to take into account from the beginning political, economic, social, technological, legal, environmental factors. Because any service should design before, realize later, put into production and support in operation several components. But for instance, when GDPR in Europe took place, we introduced some legal factors from the beginning for developing or modifying some softwares. Right now, there can be in any part of the world a different way to interact with a service and or with a software, because any country can have the different attitudes for performing, for running and erogating a service. And so social factor could be very important for providing the best service, no matter if it will be an IT service or a service not based at all on IT. Imagine to go to the restaurant. And also the way to mix all these characteristics can be modeled with the new IT service model in ITIL4 that is called the service value system. This is a model that can represent the first floor for our building. This is the base, this is the first floor, and this is the basic model we are going to explore, in particular dealing today with the guiding principle. Because when an organization moves from an opportunity to develop a new service or takes from the market its market, the demand receives a demand for services, the final goal will be, of course, to derive value. The basic question, if you were the provider and not the customer, is how? And so these 5 components will be what ITIL4 stress a lot. In particular, we'll have practices, that does mean, speaking in a simpler way, processes and some best practices, a continual improvement approach, a governance concept, the activities for a service value chain that, rephrasing the term, does mean to look to the phases for a software life cycle that will be these 6 ones. That does mean to engage before people, to create a plan, to create a project, designing all the specification and the requirements, to build the component eventually, and finally to deliver and support product and services providing value, higher or lower according to any situation. The 6th phase is the improvement phase. That does mean, as usual, in a continual improvement approach and terms, that improvements would be about anything, anywhere. That does mean to improve these phases. That does mean to improve the products, the service, and has the final goal to improve the value over time for a final customer and its users. If you can look at this 3 concept as a building, this is the base, level 0. The SVS is the first floor after the ground, and then one detail here will be the service value chain. And that means the phases for the model. What does it mean, value? And this is the explanation, because many people working in software, and many of you should be looking your names, is, okay, this is a service management model. What does it mean to look and to discuss this with my measurement role in my organization? And the contact in reality is very, very strict, because in general terms, a service is more than the creation of a product, as we saw before with the ITIL4 1-2-3 schema. And if we are matching the concept, utility in service management means what the service should do. And for measurement people, as many of you are, it means to express functional user requirements. The warranty does mean the non-functional requirements, so the how and the how much a service and their product, its components, should perform. The summation of the 2 means value. And the value includes here in this part, just to mention, the availability, the capacity, the continuity, the security, the management of service levels in a quantitative way, and also the perception. So it means that these are 2 components and both of them should be measured. For many of you, this could be to measure sometimes with function points. And here could mean to measure with snap points, with measure about ISO 25023 and something like that. And so many solutions. There is no a single solution. And so we try to discuss, if somebody of you comes from Italy, also yet in a paper just a few ago, in this meteorological journal, in 2-3 pages. If you want to read and you're able to read it Italian, eventually this could be a summary of this presentation. And here we enlarged, of course, the suggestion provided there. The guiding principle, as said before, are the core element of our presentation, because coming back a bit to the service value system, that is the service model provided by ITIL, in order to create value, that means to satisfy your customer. If you are the provider, you have to understand this principle, and we are going to follow this presentation here. But at the same time, in the way your own organization, not mine and not another organization, we should put in place a good governance, establishing as ISO 38500 standard about governance for IT organization will suggest, it's important to have a governing body. that should put in place your organization's strategy. And then we have to mix and to create, but eventually we can discuss it in another presentation, the joint relationship between processes and phases for a service life cycle, because the service value chain is the software life cycle phases. And then, of course, anything should be improved over time, as usual. So these are the 7 guiding principles, and it is very important to take them in mind in terms of number, in terms of content, and in terms of how they can be useful to us for improving from the beginning our project and improving our current services from our service catalog. And so this is the number 1, the number 2, and so on till the number 7. And now we'll go to discuss each one by one, trying for each page and each principle to discuss its measurable side. Because otherwise, it can be, of course, also from a qualitative way, a path you can eventually cross from number 1 to number 7. And but if we are going to go a little bit in deep for each one, looking how to measure both from the quantitative as well as potentially from the qualitative viewpoint, this kind of tips could be very useful for any organization, because as Tom DeMarco said many years ago, you cannot control what you cannot measure. And so that kind of well-known motto is very important to anybody, because I suppose that anybody of you for their own activities can decide to do or to do not do something basing it's his decision, her decision on numbers. And they are to be the right numbers, not just numbers, because otherwise any numbers can lead you also to the decision. And so the guiding principles are going, first of all, to focus on value. That does mean, and now we are going to look in detail each one, but just to give you a highlight on each one of the 7 guiding principles. First of all, it would be easier for any service to ask directly to the customer and its users which kind of service would they want and how should be performed, because it would be easier also for gathering requirements. But before starting a project here, potentially in an agile way, and this picture will introduce something that is very similar, very close to the picture for the Scrum. Agile project management methodology is very similar to the picture. Before step number 3, you should understand in your organization if you have something reusable from the past, if you have historical data, and then you can start to plan your project potentially in using iterative life cycles as well as Scrum or other agile methodologies, but also as in agile methodologies, at the end of each increment, at the end of each sprint, as in the Scrum methodology, to gather feedbacks, to do retrospectives, and try to gather all the information for restarting with more information for filling in new change requests for iteration number 2, number 3, etc. Number 4 is something that is very close to number 3, because here also in an agile, following the agile way, client, a customer, and the provider should collaborate. And so in the Scrum language, the product owner should collaborate actively during the project lifetime, during each sprint with the dev team. And we love more to speak about a DevOps team, not only a dev team, with a facilitation by a Scrum Master. And principle number 4 is dealing with that kind of interplay between all the stakeholders collaborating potentially into a project, but also, and that's the second part of principle 4, dealing with historical data, dealing with the project data in a sprint for updating a bar down chart or something like that. And you can apply, of course, this kind of principle also if you are looking and running a project using the waterfall way. Not a problem. The principles are universal and applicable to any project. And before going on, it's important that any principle can be applied, potentially also the other ones. And in that way, you can gather more value for your projects. But as the ITIL guide will suggest, you can apply 0 principles as well, 1, 2, till all the 7 principles together. It depends on you. The good information from ITIL4 is that it's not a mandatory model, but it's based on the adopt and adapt principle, because it's a best practice, it's not a standard, it's not mandatory. And so you can rub literally the part of the model, the part of the components described here, as well as you want in order to improve your own process. Because the real to be is to improve your own process through this kind of best practice. Okay, focus on value. Start where you are. Progress iteratively with feedback, collaborate and promote visibility, but you have to think, and this is a link with principle number 1, holistically. That does mean to take into account with a systemic view. And so also here is the right place for putting in place the so-called system thinking techniques, for instance, because you have to think before holistically, but then being yet from principle number 3 into a project, also to work holistically. What does it mean for an ICT project? Also to consider the development and the design for a project, an IT project, look into API, look into the exchange of data through web services and something like that, look into architectures. But principle number 6 is very, very, very important, is to keep the eye of the customer, but more and more, not only from the customer, that IT defines as the people who defines the requirement for a service, but from the user's viewpoint. Because a user is the people using the service. The customer, that can be also a user, is the people defining requirements. So ITIL will refine a bit now more than ever the two definitions, because a customer not necessarily is a user, and a user not necessarily could be his customer. And here we are going to be simple and practical. Here is the place where to check from the beginning if we are going to use user experience techniques, if the number of steps for achieving value you also using a software is the right one, is the minimum one to achieve the same value or not. Is the place when you have to think if it's time to revise your processes. Because the more the step for the same value, the less the value you will achieve because the service could cost more. And here is the real point where measurement can give a tip from the beginning, trying to make you, if you were a provider, to save money, but also if you were a customer, because that kind of savings will be passed from a provider also to a customer in a win-win situation, as Americans would tell. Step number 7 is the final one, but it's very important to stress a couple of messages. Automation comes later. It does not come from the beginning, also in an IT project and service, because automation should be only a way to speed up and to need less time to do the same thing that your service could do also in a manual way. And so that's why the two words used here for the title are optimize before and automate later, not the opposite. And we are going now to see each one of the 7 guiding principles at a time, moving from the original text from the ITIL guide, and then to understand step by step what will be its measurement side in order to take the most from principle number 1 to till the number 7. As said before, just a bit, can you write in chat eventually if you can if you are able to hear me in a good way, just to be sure before going on if anything is okay for you. Please type something just to know if anything is okay. Perfect. So thank you, Emily and Kyle. Hi, Alida. And just to be sure, okay. So eventually at the end of the presentation, if you will have some question to pose, please use the chat. Do not open your micro, because otherwise it could be difficult for all the other people to hear eventually to speak two people together. Great, thanks. So ITIL said for principle number one that everything that the organization does need to map should bring value to stakeholders, and it's great. Now the point is to encompass many perspectives in particular, so any stakeholder should be involved from the beginning, in particular customers and users, who derive the requirements for a service and who will use the service. From a measurable viewpoint, first of all, we should use, and here there are sometimes in the presentation some hyperlinks for facilitating those of you willing to read the slides later, because there is just 28 minutes for remaining for this presentation, including question and answer. As you know, at 2 p.m. the presentation should have been yet closed, also for allowing you to conclude your working day, eventually for coming back to work. So moving from here, the first thing is to move from the voice of customer. And there are several techniques, for instance, just to mention one, quality function deployment. Quality function deployment is one of the techniques from the 60s, from Japan, trying to put together the voice of the customer to be merged with a technical counter voice in order to match two viewpoints and to find and to derive the right priority for matching utility requirements, then in the software world it could have been called functional user requirements, and the quality requirements, often, and technical requirements, often called non-functional requirements. The real measurable reason for doing that and is to size this requirement at the right level of granularity from the beginning could be to reduce the scope creep. And this is the exact term we use both in the PMBOK guide if you were a project manager, as well as if you are looking to the IFPAC function point or cosmic function point measurement manuals, if you comes from the measurement world. If you measure, create the right requirements in a good way, trying to stimulate more and more the users, you will reduce the scope creep. You will be able to properly estimate effort and cost at that level of the life cycle phase. Your relative error between estimates and actual will be very close to zero or with a lower number than expected, because the formula is very easy. Estimated value, estimated value less the actuals divided by the actual value. This is the typical formula for calculating a relative error. And the lower the value, the better. But it does mean that anything depends on the requirement elicitation phase. So this is very, very important from the beginning. Also for reducing eventually the need for a rework on requirements later for any kind of change request that would lead to maintenance intervention. In terms of the measurement techniques, as you can read here, you can use eventually function points, whatever kind of, and at least you have 5 different versions, Cosmic, FISMA, NESMA, Mark II, as well any other kind of variants in your application domain. But another very important information is this one. Please measure the warranty side, because many estimates would fail because dealing only with functionalities, not only with the qualitative side, because quality does not mean from ever that it cannot be measured. There is a very good known book from the end of the 70s that is entitled, sorry, Quality is Free. That does mean that typically the quality is inside a solution, and ITIL is telling the same concept. Utility plus warranty does mean value. A software cannot be neither good or bad. A software must be used if you are working in a software domain, but you also taking a look how the software would perform and at which levels. And so utility plus warranty would mean to measure and to look, principle number 2, trying to reuse anything yet in place. Because in this way, and these are the keyword, considering what is already available in order to be leveraged. And it does mean, from a measurable viewpoint, please, to reuse anything. Reuse can be a process, a reuse process. Reuse is also an attribute for products, also looking this kind of ISO standard that is typically included in many bids and contracts. That should be applied also for any service assets, because it does deal with productivity, usability, security, reliability, anything that is not related to a functional requirement. If you would reuse also historical data, great. And also this is the standard, the current standard about the ISO measurement process. And this is the basic practice that any organization should do. Please gather your own historical data, because your receipt for estimate is typical to you and to your project. Of course, we can also look into ISBSG, that is the International Standard Benchmarking Software Group. That is an international association I'm representing too, as part of the board. And we have repositories for statistics, for productivity stats about performance with project size, with lines of code and function points. But it's better to have your own historical data more than looking external data. Here, another measurable tips for guiding principle number 2 is to use maturity and capability models. If you want, we are going to go deeper and deeper with this kind of subject that many of you may be known. Look into this acronym, CMMI, the capability maturity the capability maturity model integration in this kind. In this version, also look into the service side, but there are also other domains, application domains for development and acquisition. We'll deal in depth with this subject on September the 17th for another webinar, free webinar for IFPAG. And so if you could be interested in looking to maturity models about estimation and measurement, September the 17th, in a few days, there will be the news on the ifpag.org website for booking for free to this other webinar. But anyway, let's coming back to this Brightest webinar. If you have to start where you are, first of all, you have to do a calculation of your baseline, trying to understand your own current maturity and capacity level. The maturity level is about the whole organization. The capacity level is the maturity level for each process within the organization by all the projects under assessment or appraisal for your organization. So two concepts, not the same thing, but correlated in order to derive how much mature is your organization and your single projects. Currently, in the ITIL domain, there is a maturity model, but is an old way that should be replaced using something closer and very similar to CMMI. If you want to go to this hyperlink, it's just to give you some tips that we can discuss also in other Brightest webinars, if from your feedback it could be useful, and that eventually Brightest will ask to plan during next month. So Principle number one is asking to gather requirements that should be measured, elicited, and applied to a good estimate. But taking into account anything reusable, that can be a piece of software, that can be an experience, that can be a people reapplied and working for a similar project, similar to a previous one, that would imply to save time and cost for tomorrow. Number three does mean to work yet into your first iteration, in your first project. And in this case, the suggestion is to work in an explicit way, possibly not in a waterfall way, but in an agile way, trying to work into smaller, manageable sections. That does mean, as many of you knows from your practice, from your experience, and from your daily work, into an agile way. No matter if you're going to use the Scrum methodology, XP, DSDN, FTD, Crystal, or any other kind of newer agile methodology. The important message here is to split your waterfall project into parse into iteration and possibly to choose your methodology. But that's the second part of the story. As said, to use feedbacks that can lead you through retrospective, post-mortem meetings, reviews to understand how to manage your change request. And part of what I have said here is written here. From a measurable viewpoint, time ago, we created a very simple metric proposed in some meetings, and here there is a presentation. Eventually, if you are interested in the team load factor for the discussion, that can be, in a very simple way, the division, the ratio between your real effort on a single people based or a team viewpoint against the related plan a bit more than the real effort in your Gantt chart. Because if I can potentially work 40 hours, man hours per week, working week, and I have eventually to work more, okay, hope now, please tell me if my voice now is clearer. Please write me in the chat if my voice is clear or not, because eventually, okay, perfect. Perfect. Sorry for the connection, sorry. So I was telling that if the real effort is more than the planned effort, there is a problem, because it would imply that you are not taking into account any risk. You would be a people too much optimistic. And in the case one risk would happen, there is a damage. And if a risk would become a damage, you suffer at least a slippage in delivering your deliverable for your iteration, your increment into Scrum language and terminology, and or you could suffer some penalties from an economic viewpoint. So there is here, I found a very simple and funny picture just to show you the picture. Ah, no, okay, the picture was here, right? That is to play not the 15 puzzle game, in Italian would be the gioco del 15, but please do that game, but not the 16 puzzle. Because if ideally you would plan exactly 100% the effort, the potential effort for all the people in a DevOps team for your project, no risk foreseen, many potential slips and economic damage that would arise in any iteration. And so here, another process in ITIL that would be very useful is this one: how to deal with the service request management practice. And you have to measure with specific indicators and KPIs, eventually the requirement management step. Principle number 4, as we introduced before, does imply to work together, customer plus all the other stakeholders, as well as in Scrum, would be the product owner that will work with the DevOps team of the dev team, merged and facilitated by a Scrum Master. Whatever the kind of names you can give to those roles, it's important to use measures and KPIs also using those kind of suggestions. For instance, there is a maturity model for developing software or developing a service, but also there is from many, many years a very good and tough model about the people management. It is called People CMM, or there is another very good book you can buy here that is called Peopleware, that at least had plenty of suggestion, quite 400 pages in this book from Tom DeMarco and Tim Lister called Peopleware, because it does mean that you can manage software, hardware, but also the peopleware. That does imply to have a very huge impact in terms of effort and costs and the technical management for the ITIL service dimension #1 and #3 we introduced before. Again, this kind of good practice put in place in a proper way does not mean that people would be always agreeing anything, but would mean to control in a better way your bar down chart and to reduce your technical debt. Because also using some software that can be SonarQube or many others similar for measuring your code quality, technical debt is typically one of the organizational project level metrics that also some softwares, also Microsoft Azure DevOps platform and many others like that can measure. And we have several goals at a time to be on time, on quality, and on cost. And so also the team load factor would be moving from guiding principle #3, the key to control, for going to principle #5, that, as we said before, means before to think holistically to a service based on products, and then to work holistically when you are in your project, within your time frame that it could be your sprint, your iteration. And it's very, very important, this message, because for instance, also today, I'm measuring not only function points. Today, with a customer of mine, we discussed before sizing function points for a solution to understand the architecture, because it's a fundamental to understand the project scope and boundaries, as well as you were the project manager, exactly if you were the measurer for your project, because the concepts are exactly the same. And if you do not consider the internal flow of the flows, exchanging data between a front-end, a back-end, a middleware, and a data layer, imagining your technical architecture, you would underestimate effort and costs, realizing what is a very, very negative concept. That's the scope creep concept, previously mentioned. So TOGAF is the Open Group Architecture Framework, and if you are interested to know more, this is the right link to visit for download the free version of the model, dealing with several kinds of architecture, not only the technical, but also the org chart, and also the project and the database schema for your software. Different languages, but same concept you deal today. Complex that does not mean to be complicated. And so here, this message, as well as in this ISO familiar standard about the common principle for sizing software from a functional viewpoint, would suggest also that web services, cloud systems could be measured, absolutely, while many customer or many bits seems to consider those elements as something needed but not to be measured, and is not correct. Also, if you, as in the 90s, you will use components using the UML definition for what could be a component, you could also link this principle #5 also to the principle #2 about reuse, and also to the next principle that would be the next one, #6, that are going to ask us to reduce waste. minimum number of steps needed to accomplish the final objective. So if you could apply some techniques, very simple techniques as value stream mapping, applied to CPOC diagram, where CPOC does mean in the lean world to put in a place who is the supplier, which are the inputs, the process activities, the outputs, and the customer, you realize the depict of a process. And you can realize, or looking from this kind of diagram, or something a little bit light, more modern, as the business model canvas. And here there is also another link to look. If you never heard this term, what is a business model canvas? Eventually you can apply a simplification and a rephrasing of your steps and your processes, also using lead time, wait time, process time as the key time metrics to analyze for deciding if automatize or not some processes at all, partly, or absolutely to be maintained in a manual way. User experience and design thinking techniques is here the right place because less steps, same value. And also here to look to the downtime, that means in lean time terms, to look to reduce the defect, the overproduction, the waiting time, the not properly used competencies of people, talent not used, etc., are 8 drivers in order to reduce wastes. That can be a way to improve also implicitly usability and accessibility. And if you are interested in know more from Jakob Nielsen of the new web content accessibility guideline, arrived to draft version 3.0, there are clicks eventually you could do to understand a little bit more about how to measure those elements. Final, but least, the last is not necessarily the least principle. Optimize first, automate later. That means eventually to try to use the automation in order to make think in less time. But it does mean to do not cancel the human intervention, but to move humans were more valuable. From this viewpoint, perfect. Emily is telling me that if you can read it in the chat, that a new UX United course is coming in the next few months. So if you were interested in that kind of topic, please book your free seat for the next webinar on UX. Concluding here our presentation, automation should be put here. Pre-authorized task, high repetitive, low risk. It typically is what in ITIL, in service management, is implemented from a basket, from a backlog of standard changes that are exactly that kind of the kind of changes with these three characteristics. Because imagine the login step on your computer. The login step on your computer allows you to do it with a software because it's high repetitive for many people. It's at low risk activity because you have been pre-authorized by someone. And so from the second time on, you are free to do it by yourself, as well as modifying your data on a website, etc. Here, for instance, the automation for software project could be good here, but not here. In the function point domain, please do use software for the static code analysis, but please do not use, if not for particular task, software for measuring function points. Because if a requirement in terms of words should be modified, the tool, any tool from ever and for till 3000, the year 3000 will be never good to model the human language. I can show you a plenty in another presentation, of course, and a plenty of titles for do not mentioning anything here from the 90s but at least you have to pass from UML notation or user stories, but you have to force yourself to write in that way and then to use a UML file, for instance, in order to be imported in a tool. But also the parsing of code that is writing after writing requirements, while function points, for instance, are based on requirements, emphasize requirements before writing code, would be something not useful for anybody. So automation should be applied only where also the results can be repeatable. And this is a very, very important point for eventually our next webinar in order to find the hybrid mode that could be a good balancing way for measuring something in a very good way. And since we are just missing 4 minutes, remember this picture. A good service could be good and fast, but not cheap. Or it can be eventually good and cheap, but not fast. Or it can be, as in the picture, in the demanded picture, could be eventually cheap and fast, but not good. And so if you wait a bit, the combination could lead you to take 2 out of 3 of these characteristics, but not all the 3 at the same level. So the 4 messages from this presentation for concluding is that service or project manager, please use the merge of the two, because a service includes the project management rules. Because a temporary endeavor undertaking to create a product, a service, or results means that also, as PMBOK told, that also a service that is an operational service is a project. But is a project really, and so not only because a guide, whatever kind of, tells that is true or false, because also for if you were a service manager, you create a WBS, a Gantt chart, and you will do anything that a project manager will do in the development project. Value is the rival point. That does mean to understand also looking, if you want, these technical and contractual references, possibly accessing documents, and also the warranty side, the quality side, the non-functional side must be measured. It is the real adding point to be added for many of our projects. Measurement. Just in April this year, we created with the Italian function point user group this national standard. And the next step will be to include in ECF in a couple of years the measurement specialist, and not the function point specialist, but the competence for a measurement specialist dealing with any kind of measure, service level, incident, problem, number of lines of code, whatever kind of measures. This competence will enter in a very short way and time frame, also in bids and contracts. But the final message is this one. Please take a look as a checklist to this 7 guiding principle from ITIL4, and please trying to keep your measurable tips and trying to apply what could be useful, but just for you, not necessarily for me or for one of the other colleagues in chat here. Thanks, Carol. Thanks a lot. And just a final message for leaving you with an optimistic message. Please see what you are doing right now as the eventually half empty and not half full and not half empty. Because the lesson learned would be, if you are going also to look at some strips by Dilbert, that is an engineer, this people is Dilbert, is that the numbers are important, but if an engineer would have a viewpoint, often the boss, the businessman, has another viewpoint. ITIL plus measurement is more than solely service management suggestions. And thanking you for the attention. If you have some question eventually, I would be very, very glad to thank you for the attention eventually, for having shared this hour of time with me and all our peers. I'm here for you. Oh, and eventually this is my email address for any written question or my contact data if you want eventually to share some thoughts with me, or now or later with somebody else. So I'm close the presentation here, and if there is some question from somebody of you, hello, good morning, Anjali. I'm here. Otherwise, in a few minutes, I'm disappearing from the screen. Not kidding, but just for because the hour of time we have has passed. It seems just 30 minutes, but 1 hour has been passed, and anybody have to come back to work possibly. So
absolutely. So thank you very much, Luigi, for this excellent presentation. Fortunately, we do not have the last slide there with also our contacts, as you can know more about what you referred to about the IFPUG details through the website of Brightest. I'll just say it out loud. It's www.brightest.org. So you're welcome to visit the page if you'd like to know more. For now, I will thank you again. Our time is up, but we will have our next Brightest webinar next 12th of July regarding the ISTQB CTAL test analyst certification. So that will be our next appointment. So for now, well, Luigi, thank you again. We will see you certainly in our next, in the months to come, to listen more in detail about what you just presented today.
Thank you. Thank you to Brightest, to Emily, to Kyle, and to you all for being here. Bye-bye and have a good day.
Goodbye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.